In the autumn of 1956, Britain launched a military invasion it was certain it could win. The troops were ready. The warships were in position. The paratroopers had already dropped from the sky and were fighting their way through Egyptian port towns. The Royal Air Force had destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in the opening hours. By every conventional military measure, the operation was working. Britain was winning. And then, within 48 hours, it stopped. Not because the Egyptians had repelled the invasion. Not because the army had failed in the field. Not because Britain had run out of soldiers or ammunition or warships. Britain was forced to halt a military operation it was winning. Because it was running out of something far more fundamental. It was running out of money. And the person holding the financial gun to Britain's head was not an enemy. It was an ally. It was the President of the United States of America. This is the story of the Suez Crisis. And like most stories that get sanitized into documentary series and school textbooks, the version most people know leaves out the most important chapter. The chapter that explains why a military operation succeeding on every tactical level collapsed within days. The chapter that reveals how a dispute over a canal in the Egyptian desert became the moment the British Empire publicly and finally discovered what it had actually become. The chapter that is less about tanks and paratroopers and far more about sterling reserves, bond markets, and the terrifying leverage that comes from being a bankrupt nation trying to behave like a wealthy one. To understand what happened in those 48 hours in November of 1956, you first have to understand what Britain thought it still was, and what it had quietly, catastrophically become. After the Second World War, Britain emerged from the rubble carrying a weight of debt that would have been unimaginable to any Victorian chancellor. Its national debt had climbed to 249% of GDP. The entire overseas investment portfolio that had once made London the undisputed financial capital of the world had been systematically liquidated to pay for 6 years of industrial-scale warfare. Britain had entered that war as the largest creditor nation on earth. It emerged as one of the largest debtors. The transformation was total, and it was permanent. The American government had extracted terms of painful precision through the Anglo-American Loan Agreement, signed in December of 1946. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's most brilliant economist and its chief negotiator, had arrived in Washington, hoping to secure a grant, or at the very minimum, an interest-free loan. What he got was $3.75 billion at 2% interest, with a clause that required Britain to make sterling freely convertible to dollars within a year of the agreement coming into force. Keynes accepted it because Britain had no alternative. He reportedly told colleagues it was the worst assignment of his life. He died of a heart attack 4 months after the negotiations concluded, though the official cause was listed as exhaustion. The convertibility clause turned out to be a trap of devastating precision. When sterling was made freely convertible in July of 1947, the result was a financial hemorrhage that shocked even those who had seen it coming. Holders of sterling balances around the world, countries and institutions that had accumulated pounds during the war through trade and lend-lease arrangements, immediately began converting their holdings to dollars. The dollar was hard. The dollar was trusted. The dollar was backed by the most powerful economy on earth. Within 6 weeks, Britain had burned through nearly $700 million of its reserves, roughly $1 billion in total losses when you count the preceding weeks. The pace was so ruinous that convertibility had to be suspended after just 37 days, in a reversal so abrupt and so public that it caused serious damage to Britain's international financial credibility for years afterward. The pound sterling, which had reigned as the world's reserve currency for more than a century, the unit in which empires borrowed, in which international trade was denominated, in which the price of commodities was set from Lagos to Lahore, was now a currency under permanent siege. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, which had redrawn the international monetary order while the war was still being fought, had placed the dollar at the center of the global financial system. Every other currency would maintain a fixed exchange rate against the dollar. The dollar itself would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Britain had signed that agreement because it had needed American money too badly to refuse. And in signing it, Britain had formalized what was already written in the balance sheets. The age of sterling was over. The age of the dollar had begun, and yet Britain could not bring itself to accept this. Could not, and perhaps more accurately, would not. The psychology of a declining empire is a peculiar and dangerous thing. You can see the numbers changing. You can feel the weight shifting. You can watch the gold leave the vaults. But the habits of supremacy, the reflexes built over a century of unquestioned dominance, are extraordinarily difficult to shed. In 1956, Britain still administered colonies and territories on every inhabited continent. The Commonwealth connected it to nations from India to Australia to Canada to Nigeria. The Royal Navy still patrolled seas that had once been referred to without irony as British waters. And the Suez Canal, the 100-mile waterway sliced through Egyptian desert that connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and from there to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean and the trade routes of Asia, was still controlled by a company in which Britain was the largest single shareholder and still garrisoned by British troops under a treaty signed on British terms. The canal was not simply a strategic asset, it was a symbol. It was the physical, material embodiment of what the British Empire believed it still was. 67 million tons of cargo transited it every year by the mid-1950s. 1/3 of all ships passing through flew the British flag. The oil of the Persian Gulf, without which British industry and the British military could not function, moved through it. To lose control of the canal was not merely a logistical inconvenience, it was an existential statement about Britain's standing in the world. Then, on the evening of the 26th of July, 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser made that statement. Nasser had come to power through the Free Officers' Revolution of 1952 that had ended the reign of King Farouk, a monarchy so corrupt and so closely associated with British influence that its overthrow had been broadly popular not just in Egypt, but across an Arab world that was watching. Country by country, the old colonial structures begin to fracture. He was 38 years old in 1956. He was lean, magnetic, a commanding speaker who understood the new medium of radio and used it to build a personal connection with ordinary Arabs across the entire region. His rhetoric was nationalist, pan-Arab, and explicitly anti-colonial, and it resonated with a depth and a force that the British establishment, listening from London with habitual condescension, consistently failed to understand. The immediate trigger for what happened that July evening was financial. The United States and Britain had agreed to fund the Aswan High Dam, Nasser's signature infrastructure project, a massive concrete structure designed to control the Nile flood and generate the electricity that would power Egypt's industrialization. The funding was then abruptly withdrawn. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, a cold and precise man who regarded foreign policy as a chess game, had concluded that Nasser was tilting dangerously toward the Soviet Union. He had accepted Soviet arms shipments. He had recognized Communist China. He was attending the Bandung Conference and positioning Egypt as a leader of the non-aligned movement. Dulles pulled the dam funding with deliberate public humiliation, making certain Nasser would learn of the withdrawal from news reports rather than through diplomatic channels. Nasser's response was theatrical, calculated, and completely devastating to everything Britain thought it still controlled. He delivered a 3-hour speech in Alexandria on the 26th of July that was broadcast live on radio across the Arab world. He spoke about imperialism. He spoke about colonialism. He spoke about the right of nations to control their own resources. And then, at the moment he uttered the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the 19th century French engineer who had built the canal, he set in motion a sequence of events that had been prepared in secret for weeks. That name was a prearranged signal to Egyptian technicians and military officers who were listening on their radios across the country. Within minutes, Egyptian forces had moved into every Suez Canal Company office from Port Said to Suez City. Company staff were arrested at their desks. The waterway that Britain had controlled, in one form or another, since 1875 when Benjamin Disraeli had borrowed £4 million from the Rothschild Bank to purchase the Egyptian Khedive's share in a single weekend, was now Egyptian. In London, the reaction was volcanic. Anthony Eden had been waiting his entire career for the premiership. He had served as Foreign Secretary under Churchill for years, widely regarded as the most elegant and accomplished diplomat of his generation. He was silver-haired and patrician, a man who wore his foreign policy experience like a suit of armor, and who believed in the British Empire with a conviction that was closer to religion than to politics. When the news of the nationalization reached him at a formal dinner at 10 Downing Street, he reportedly went pale with fury. His characterization of Nasser was instant and visceral. He told colleagues that Nasser had his hand on Britain's windpipe, He compared the Egyptian president to Mussolini. He compared him to Hitler. He was determined from that first evening that Nasser had to be removed from power. What is extraordinary in retrospect is not Eden's emotional response. It is his blindness. Eden could see the strategic problem with perfect clarity. He was completely blind to the financial reality that made his proposed solution catastrophic. Because here is the critical detail that changes everything about this story. By the autumn of 1956, Britain's gold and dollar reserves, the reserves that backed the pound sterling and gave it credibility as an international currency, stood at approximately $2 billion. That sounds substantial until you understand the context. The sterling area, the network of countries in the Commonwealth and beyond, that pegged their currencies to the pound and held their reserves in sterling rather than dollars, represented a system of monetary relationships that covered a significant fraction of global trade. The pound's credibility was not just a matter of British national pride. It was the anchor of an entire international monetary architecture that dozens of nations depended upon, and the entire edifice rested on the assumption that Britain's reserves were adequate to defend the peg. They were barely adequate under normal conditions. Under the conditions that Eden was proposing to create, they would not be adequate at all. Harold Macmillan was Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer in the autumn of 1956. He was a complicated man, a veteran of the First World War who had been wounded 3 times at the Somme and Passchendaele, a reader of Trollope and Dickens, a political operator of considerable cunning who masked his ambition behind a performance of Edwardian languid ease. As Chancellor, he was supposed to be the man who understood the financial stakes. And in the weeks before the operation, he made an assessment that would define the rest of his career. He told Eden, and told the cabinet, that the Americans would not intervene to stop a British military operation once it was underway. He calculated that while Eisenhower would express displeasure, he would ultimately accept a fait accompli. Britain and France and Israel could move fast enough and decisively enough that by the time Washington had decided what to do, the canal would already be secured. This was not merely wrong. It was catastrophically, comprehensively, irreversibly wrong. And Macmillan's miscalculation cost Britain its empire. Dwight Eisenhower was serving his second term as President of the United States in 1956. He was a former Supreme Allied Commander, a man who had coordinated the largest military alliance in human history and brought it to victory over Nazi Germany. He was not given to theatrical responses or easily provoked. But the Suez operation provoked him in a way that went beyond personal anger. It threatened to destroy, at the most delicate possible moment, the entire geopolitical narrative that his administration had been constructing. The Soviet Union had just invaded Hungary. On the 4th of November 1956, Soviet tanks were rolling through the streets of Budapest, crushing an uprising that the people of Hungary had launched in the belief that the West stood for freedom. The United States was trying to position itself as the defender of oppressed nations against Soviet imperialism. And 2 of America's closest allies were simultaneously launching their own imperial military operation against an Arab country on the other side of the world. The propaganda gift to Moscow was incalculable. Soviet Foreign Minister Shepilov was able to stand up at the United Nations and ask with perfect rhetorical justification, "What is the difference between what we are doing in Hungary and what Britain and France are doing in Egypt?" It was, as Eisenhower's speechwriters understood with mounting horror, an extremely difficult question to answer. Eisenhower did not confront Britain with troops or ultimatums. He confronted it with something far more powerful. He confronted it with the dollar. The specific mechanism of what happened next deserves to be understood with precision, because it is one of the most consequential exercises of financial power in modern history. Eisenhower instructed Treasury Secretary George Humphrey to begin selling pounds on the open currency markets, not through back channels or quiet diplomatic pressure, publicly, visibly, in a volume that sent an unmistakable signal to every bank and central institution and currency trader in the world. The United States government was not withholding support from the pound. It was actively attacking it. The message required no translation. If Britain continued the military operation, the United States would continue selling sterling until the currency collapsed. The effect was immediate, dramatic, and devastating. In the first week of November alone, Britain lost approximately $160 million in gold and dollar reserves. To put that in perspective, that represented roughly 8% of Britain's entire reserve stock, gone in 7 days. The pound began sliding against the dollar on international markets. Institutions and individuals that held sterling balances, looking at the reserve figures and reading the American political signals, began quietly converting their holdings to dollars. The currency markets were moving against Britain with a momentum that the Treasury had not seen since the catastrophe of 1947. And unlike 1947, this time the crisis was entirely self-inflicted. Harold Macmillan gathered the reserve figures and presented them to the cabinet. What he told the assembled ministers in that cabinet room was simple and irrefutable. If the military operation continued, if Britain held to its position in the face of American pressure, the country would exhaust its ability to defend the sterling peg within weeks. The pound would have to be devalued. And if the pound was devalued, the sterling area, that entire network of countries whose monetary system was built around the British currency, would begin to disintegrate. The financial consequences would reach into every corner of the economy, into the price of imports, into the cost of servicing the national debt, into the living standards of ordinary British people who had nothing to do with any of this and who had never heard of the Suez Canal Company. Simultaneously, Britain applied to the International Monetary Fund for an emergency standby drawing of approximately $1.3 billion, which was the sum the Treasury calculated it needed to stop the reserves bleeding and restore market confidence in sterling. The IMF, whose voting structure gave the United States the largest single block of votes and effective veto power over major decisions, declined to approve the drawing until Britain announced a ceasefire. This was not procedural delay. This was not bureaucratic caution. This was financial coercion executed with surgical precision. The Americans had placed a condition on the medicine: withdraw, or we withhold the cure. The World Bank added its own pressure. Eugene Black, the bank's president, who had personal relationships at the highest levels of both governments, made clear through private channels that international financial support was contingent on Britain stepping back from its military position. The message from every dollar-denominated institution of consequence was identical and unmistakable. The oil companies piled on. The United States deliberately declined to authorize an emergency increase in Western Hemisphere oil supplies to compensate for the disruption to Middle Eastern oil flows that the crisis was causing. Britain, whose economy depended on Persian Gulf oil flowing through the canal, was watching its fuel situation deteriorate at the same moment its currency was under attack. The financial pressure, the currency pressure, and the energy pressure were all being applied simultaneously by the same source. Eden convened a cabinet meeting on the 6th of November. Macmillan presented the reserve figures. The Treasury delivered its assessment of what continued military operation would mean for sterling over the following weeks and months. The conclusions were clear, and they admitted of no dispute. Britain could not continue, not because the military situation was untenable, though the operation was encountering complications, and Egyptian resistance at Port Said was fiercer than anticipated. Britain could not continue because the financial situation was untenable. The reserves were draining at a rate that pointed toward catastrophe. The Americans were not going to relent. The IMF money was locked behind an American veto that would remain in place until a ceasefire was announced. And without that money, without American financial support, without a restoration of international confidence in sterling, Britain faced a currency crisis that would be remembered long after anyone cared about a canal in Egypt. At 3 in the afternoon on the 6th of November 1956, Anthony Eden telephoned French Prime Minister Guy Mollet to inform him that Britain was ordering an immediate ceasefire. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Mollet was stunned. The French had not been fully informed of the severity of the British financial position. They had not been warned that withdrawal was imminent. Britain had secretly planned the operation with France, had persuaded France to commit troops and aircraft and political capital, and was now unilaterally announcing its withdrawal mid-campaign without prior consultation. France would follow within hours because it had no choice. Without British logistics and without American acquiescence, the operation was militarily unsustainable. The military operation that had been working was over. Now here is the part of this story that gets buried in most accounts. Because the Suez Crisis was not just the product of financial pressure in November of 1956. It was the product of a deception that reached back to the previous month. A deception so significant that its existence was classified and denied at the highest levels of the British government for decades, and whose revelation confirmed what most informed observers had long suspected. In late October of 1956, in a private house in the Paris suburb of Sèvres, senior representatives of Britain, France, and Israel sat down behind closed doors and agreed on a coordinated plan of deliberate military deception. Israel would attack Egyptian Sinai. Britain and France would then issue a joint ultimatum demanding that both Israel and Egypt withdraw 10 miles from the canal to allow Anglo-French forces to intervene as supposed peacekeepers. Since Israel was attacking Egypt and moving toward the canal from the east, not from it, this ultimatum was structurally designed to be acceptable to Israel and unacceptable to Egypt. When Egypt inevitably refused to withdraw from its own territory, Britain and France would launch their intervention under the legal cover of separating the combatants. The document that recorded this agreement was called the Protocol of Sèvres. It was, by any honest reckoning, a fraud, a deliberate, premeditated fraud dressed in the language of international responsibility. Eden subsequently denied that any collusion had occurred. He denied it in Parliament. He denied it in interviews. He denied it to his own cabinet colleagues who had not been fully briefed. He ordered the British copy of the protocol destroyed. It was not destroyed. Copies survived in French and Israeli archives. When their contents became publicly known decades later, they confirmed that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom had lied to Parliament about the origins of a military operation that had convulsed the world. Eden maintained his denials until his death in 1977. The historical record does not support him. The political wreckage of Suez was total and personal. Eden had a physical and psychological breakdown in the days following the ceasefire. He flew to Jamaica on medical orders to recuperate at the estate of a friend. When he returned to London in late November, he addressed Parliament in a performance that observers across the political spectrum found unconvincing and painful to watch. The man who had spent 30 years cultivating the image of a statesman, who had resigned from Chamberlain's cabinet in 1938 over appeasement, with what looked at the time like principled courage, who had waited his entire career for the moment when he could lead Britain in a crisis worthy of his talents, had produced a fiasco that became a byword for self-deception and institutional failure. Eden resigned in January of 1957. He cited ill health. He was 59 years old, and he never held office again. He spent the remaining 20 years of his life writing his memoirs and defending decisions that he could not fully explain in public without acknowledging crimes that had been denied under oath. Harold Macmillan, who had given Eden the fatally wrong advice about American tolerance, who had been one of the leading hawks in the cabinet in the weeks before the operation, and one of the leading advocates for ceasefire once the reserves figures came in, somehow emerged from the wreckage with his career not just intact, but enhanced. He became Prime Minister in Eden's place in January of 1957, and 3 years later, in Cape Town, he delivered a speech that contained one of the most honest acknowledgments of imperial decline in British political history. "The wind of change is blowing through this continent," he told the South African Parliament, "and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact." The man who had helped precipitate the crisis that made that wind irresistible was the same man who acknowledged it as inevitable. The Americans consolidated everything they had won. Eisenhower had not opposed the Suez operation out of anti-imperial principle. He was not a sentimentalist about Egyptian sovereignty or Arab self-determination. He had opposed it because it was creating a strategic catastrophe at the worst possible moment in the Cold War. But in resolving the crisis on American terms, in forcing Britain to capitulate to financial rather than military pressure, the United States completed a transfer of global power that had been underway since Lend-Lease and Bretton Woods and the Anglo-American Loan. Britain was not a partner, it was a client. The special relationship, that phrase which British politicians still invoke with an earnestness that American ones find quietly amusing, had been revealed as a relationship between a patron and a dependent, not between equals. The Eisenhower Doctrine, announced in January of 1957, was the formal declaration of what Suez had demonstrated in practice. America would now provide military and economic support to Middle Eastern nations resisting communism. The phrase meant in practice that America was stepping into the regional vacuum that Britain's humiliation had created. The dominant Western power east of Suez was no longer British. It was American. The process that had been playing out since 1941, since the moment Churchill first called Roosevelt in desperate need of American assistance, had reached its logical and final destination on a sandbar in the Egyptian desert. And the decolonization that followed moved far faster than anyone in London had anticipated. The Suez Crisis did not cause decolonization. The underlying forces, nationalism, economic exhaustion, international pressure, the simple unsustainability of administering vast territories by force, were already in motion before the first British paratrooper dropped on Port Said. But Suez accelerated those forces with an intensity that transformed a managed retreat into something far less controlled. After November of 1956, it was impossible for any serious observer to maintain the illusion that Britain possessed either the financial resources or the political credibility to hold an empire together against the will of the people being held. Between 1957 and 1968, Britain granted independence to more than 20 territories. Ghana in 1957, Malaya the same year, Cyprus in 1960, Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone in 1961, Tanzania in 1961, Jamaica in 1962, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, Malawi in 1964, Malta in 1964, Zambia in 1964, Gambia in 1965, Barbados in 1966, Botswana in 1966, Lesotho in 1966, and others. The country that had administered a quarter of the world's land surface at the peak of its imperial reach in 1921 was, within 2 generations of that peak, a medium-sized European island nation with a permanent seat on the Security Council it could not have obtained. Without the empire it had just surrendered, and a nuclear deterrent it could not deploy independently of the Americans whose financial pressure had ended the empire. The pound sterling was devalued in 1967, 11 years after Suez. Harold Wilson's government, struggling with exactly the same sterling crisis dynamics that Macmillan had described to Eden's cabinet in that November meeting, finally accepted that the pound's exchange rate against the dollar could not be defended. The sterling area that had been built around the pound's credibility was already disintegrating before the devaluation and collapsed in the years that followed it. The dollar replaced sterling as the anchor of international trade, not through a formal ceremony, but through 1,000 quiet decisions by central banks and trading desks around the world to hold dollars rather than pounds. Now, I want to be precise about what this story actually means, because it is a story where oversimplification is easy and tempting. The Suez Crisis was not simply a story about American bullying. Eden had made decisions that were strategically reckless, legally indefensible, and built on a lie. The Protocol of Sèvres was not a noble piece of statecraft that Washington unjustly punished. It was a deception that violated the United Nations Charter, that betrayed the Arab world that Britain had spent decades claiming to partner with, and that put Britain's entire financial position at risk for the sake of a piece of prestige that had already been hollowed out by the preceding decade of debt and dependency. But it is equally imprecise to tell this story as though the financial collapse of 1956 was somehow separate from the broader pattern of imperial overextension. The Suez Crisis was not an accident or a failure of intelligence. It was the inevitable consequence of a country that had been trying since 1945 to maintain a first-class imperial presence on a third-class financial foundation, borrowing the money it needed to look powerful, and then being reminded, at the worst possible moment, who it had borrowed from. The British Empire was not destroyed by Nasser. It was destroyed by debt. Nasser merely provided the occasion for the creditors to call in the loan. And there is a final irony that history has composed with a precision that almost no novelist would dare attempt. The Suez Canal Company had been purchased in 1875 by Benjamin Disraeli, using £4 million borrowed from Lionel de Rothschild, of the same Rothschild banking dynasty whose name appears on the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which promised British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which created the conditions for the existence of the State of Israel, which launched the military attack on Egyptian Sinai in October 1956, that provided the pretext for the Anglo-French intervention that Britain could not afford to sustain and was forced to abandon within 48 hours. The threads of debt and empire and banking and land and promise and betrayal that run through this region do not connect in straight lines. They spiral back on themselves, they recur, they compound. Britain borrowed money to buy into a canal. 81 years later, it borrowed credibility. It did not have to try to retake that canal. And when the bill came due, it could not pay. The ships were ordered to stop. The troops were told to stand down. And Britain, without ceremony, without formal acknowledgement, without any moment of public reckoning that the scale of the event deserved, ceased to be an empire. Not on the beaches of the Somme, not on the docks at Dunkirk, not in the ruins of the Blitz or the jungles of Burma or the plains of India. On a currency exchange, in the time it takes to sell enough pounds. The world did not end when Britain's empire did, but a particular idea of how the world worked, an idea that had organized the lives of hundreds of millions of people for a century and a half, died in those 48 hours. And the world that replaced it, the world of dollar supremacy and American strategic dominance and post-colonial nationalism and Middle Eastern instability, is still the world we are living in today. If you made it this far, leave a # in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.